Chapter 11. The Virtues at Athens. Heroic societies, as they are represented by the Homeric poems or the Icelandic or the Irish sagas, may or may not have existed. But the belief that they had existed was crucial to those classical and Christian societies which understood themselves as having emerged from the conflicts of heroic society, and which defined their own standpoint partially in terms of that emergence. No 5th-century Athenian could behave just as Agamemnon or Achilles behaved. No 13th-century Icelander could have behaved quite like the men of the 10th century. The monks at Clonmacnois were very different from Concobar or Cuchulainn. Yet the heroic literature provided a central part of the moral scriptures of those later societies, and it is from the difficulties involved in relating those scriptures to actual practice that many of the key moral characteristics of the later societies arise. In many of Plato's earlier dialogues, Socrates interrogates one or more Athenians as to the nature of some virtue. Courage in the Laches, piety in the Euthyphro, justice in Republic 1, in such a way as to convict the other of inconsistency. The casual modern reader might easily suppose at first that Plato is contrasting Socrates' rigor with the carelessness of the ordinary Athenian. But as the pattern recurs again and again, another interpretation suggests itself, namely, that Plato is pointing to a general state of incoherence in the use of evaluative language in Athenian culture. When Plato, in the Republic, produces his own coherent, well-integrated account of the virtues, part of his strategy is to expel the Homeric inheritance from the city-state. One starting point for an inquiry into the virtues in classical society would be to establish a connection between some of the basic incoherence in classical society and the Homeric background. But the task turns out to have been already accomplished, most notably perhaps by Sophocles in the Philoctetes. Odysseus has been sent on a mission with Neoptolemus, the son of Achilles, to secure Philoctetes' magical bow to aid the taking of Troy. Odysseus behaves in the play according to precisely the same canons which govern his behavior in the Odyssey. He does good to his friends, harm to his foes, thus satisfying one of the definitions of justice which Plato rejects at the beginning of the Republic. If he cannot get the aid of the bow by open means, his cunning will devise deceitful means. In the Odyssey, that cunning is treated unambiguously as a virtue, and it is of course for his exercise of the virtues that a hero received honor. But Neoptolemus sees Odysseus' stratagem to deceive Philoctetes as dishonorable. Philoctetes had been grossly wronged by the Greeks, who had left him to suffer for 9 years on Lemnos. Philoctetes has nevertheless received Neoptolemus and Odysseus with trust. Even though he now refuses to come to the aid of the Greeks at Troy, it is wrong to deceive him. Sophocles uses Odysseus and Neoptolemus to confront us with two incompatible conceptions of honorable conduct, two rival standards for behavior. It is crucial to the structure of the tragedy that Sophocles offers us no resolution of this conflict. The action is interrupted, rather than completed, by the intervention of the semi-divine Hercules, which rescues the characters from their impasse. The intervention of a god in Greek tragedy, or at the very least an appeal to a god to intervene, often signals the disclosure of an incoherence in moral standards and vocabulary. Consider the Oresteia. The archaic and heroic rules of vendetta both enjoin and forbid Orestes to kill Clytemnestra. The intervention of Athena and the resolution of the issue between her and Apollo establish a connection of justice which shifts the center of authority in moral questions from the family and the household to the polis. In the Antigone, the demands of the family and the demands of the polis appear precisely as rival and incompatible demands. Thus, the first massive fact that we have to reckon with is the difference that it makes to the conception of the virtues when the primary moral community is no longer the kinship group, but the city-state, and not merely the city-state in general, but the Athenian democracy in particular. Yet it is far too simple to see the difference between the Homeric view and the classical view of the virtues as residing in a transition from one set of social forms to another, and this for at least two very different reasons. The first is that, as the Antigone alone is sufficient to suggest, the forms and claims of kinship, although not the same in 5th century Athens as they had been in earlier centuries, survive in substantial form. The aristocratic household preserves a good deal of Homer in life as well as in poetry. But the Homeric values no longer define the moral horizon, just as the household or kinship group are now part of a larger and very different unit. There are no more kings, even though many of the virtues of kingship are still held to be virtues. A second reason for not seeing the difference in the conception of the virtues simply in terms of changed social contexts is that the conception of a virtue has now become strikingly detached from that of any particular social role. Neoptolemus confronts Philocrates in Sophocles' play in a way very different from that in which his father confronted Agamemnon in the Iliad. In Homer, the question of honor is the question of what is due to a king. In Sophocles, the question of honor has become the question of what is due to a man. Nonetheless, it seems no accident that the question of what is due to a man is raised in an Athenian and not in a Theban or a Corinthian, let alone a barbarian context. To characterize a good man is in crucial part to characterize the relationship in which such a man stands to others, and both poets and philosophers for the most part do not distinguish in their account of these relationships what is universal and human from what is local and Athenian. The claim is often explicit. Athens is praised because she, par excellence, exhibits human life as it ought to be. Yet, in these very acts of praise, Athenian particularity is distinguished from Homeric particularity. For Homeric man, there could be no standard external to those embodied in the structures of his own community to which appeal could be made. For Athenian man, the matter is more complex. His understanding of the virtues does provide him with standards by which he can question the life of his own community and inquire whether this or that practice or policy is just. Nevertheless, he also recognizes that he possesses his understanding of the virtues only because his membership in the community provides him with such understanding. The city is a guardian, a parent, a teacher, even though what is learnt from the city may lead to a questioning of this or that feature of its life. Thus the question of the relationship between being a good citizen and being a good man becomes central, and the knowledge of the variety of possible human practices, barbarian as well as Greek, provided the factual background to the asking of that question. Of course, all the evidence is that the overwhelming majority of all Greeks, whether Athenian or not, took it for granted that the way of life of their own city was unquestionably the best way of life for man, if it even occurred to them to raise the question at all, and it was equally taken for granted that what Greeks shared was clearly superior to any barbarian way of life. But what then did Greeks share, and what did Athenians share? A.W.H. Adkins has usefully contrasted the cooperative with the competitive virtues. The competitive he sees as Homeric in their artistry. The cooperative represent the social world of the Athenian democracy. But at this point, complexity enters. For moral disagreement in the 5th and 4th centuries does not only arise because one set of virtues is counterposed to another. It is also, and perhaps more importantly, because rival conceptions of one and the same virtue coexist, that conflict is engendered. The nature of dikosune, which we have come to translate as justice, is the subject of just such disagreement. Moreover, dikaisune, disagreement over which may be a source of social conflict, is one of the virtues which Adkins sees as cooperative rather than competitive. But dikosune, although the word itself does not appear in Homer, has Homeric overtones. Dike and dikaios, which do appear in Homer are its ancestors, and already in Homer the competitive virtues presuppose the acceptance of the cooperative. It is because Dike has been outraged that Achilles falls out with Agamemnon, and it is because Dike has been outraged that Athena aids Odysseus against the suitors. What then is the virtue which becomes dikaiosune? Dike means basically the order of the universe, wrote Hugh Lloyd-Jones, and the dikaios is the man who respects and does not violate that order. At once the difficulty in translating dikaios by the term just is clear. For someone in our own culture may use the word just without any reference to or belief in a moral order in the universe. But even in the 5th century, the nature of the relationship between dikaiosune and some cosmic order is not clear in the way that it was in the Homeric poems. There the order in which kings reign, admittedly imperfectly, is part of the larger order in which gods, and especially Zeus, reign, admittedly imperfectly. To be dikaios in Homer is not to transgress that order. Thus, in Homer, the virtue of the dikaios is to do what the accepted order requires, and in this his virtue is like every other Homeric virtue. But by the latter part of the 5th century it is possible to ask if it is or is not dikaiosune to do what the established order requires, and it is possible to disagree radically as to what it would be to act in accordance with Dike, to be dikaios. So, in Philoctetes, both Neoptolemus and Odysseus claim dikaiosune for their side of the argument. And within the same few lines they disagree also about what it is to be sophos, wise, and to be aiskros, disgraceful. There are then a received set of virtue words in 5th century Greek, and in that sense a received set of virtues: friendship, courage, self-restraint, wisdom, justice. And not only these. But as to what each of these requires, and as to why each is counted as a virtue, there is extended disagreement. So that those who unreflectingly rely on ordinary usage, on what they have been taught, will all too easily find themselves trapped in inconsistency in just the way that Socrates' partners in dialogue so often are. I have, of course, oversimplified both the causes and the effects of that inconsistency. Even if heroic society did exist in, say, 9th century Greece, the transition from that society to the 5th century was far more complex and many-layered than I have indicated. The conceptions of the virtues in the 6th century, in the early 5th century, and in the later 5th century all differ in important respects, and each earlier period leaves its mark on each of its successors. The effect of this is evident as much in modern scholarly disputes as in ancient moral disagreements. Dodds, Adkins, Lloyd-Jones, and the list could be extended into a very long one, all present largely coherent pictures of the Greek moral outlook. Each coherent view differs from each of the others, and all seem to be largely right. What none allow for adequately is the possibility that the Greek moral vocabulary and outlook is a good deal more incoherent than we find it easy to recognize, and one reason is obvious. Too many of the sources are texts in which a deliberate reorganization and redefinition of the moral vocabulary is taking place, texts in which words are being assigned a clear meaning which they earlier did not possess. Philosophers, poets, historians may all be apt to betray us in this way, and we have very few sources which do not come to us through one or the other of these. We therefore have to be wary of speaking too easily of the so-called Greek view of the virtues, not just because we often say the term Greek where we should say Athenian, but also because that there were a number of Athenian views. For my present purposes, I need to consider at least 4, those of the Sophists, of Plato, of Aristotle, and of the tragedians, especially Sophocles. But it is important in each case to remember that we are dealing with a response to incoherence, a response in each case informed by a different purpose. Yet, before I consider these four, let me underline at least one thing that they all do share. All do take for granted that the milieu in which the virtues are to be exercised and in terms of which they are to be defined is the polis. In the Philoktetes, it is essential to the action that Philoktetes, by being left in a desert island for 10 years, has not been merely exiled from the company of mankind, but also from the status of a human being. You left me friendless, solitary, without a city, a corpse among the living. This is not mere rhetoric. For us, the notion that friendship, company, and a city-state are essential components of humanity is alien, and between us and this concept lies a great historical divide. For example, the word for solitary, eremos, is the ancestor of our word hermit, and for Christianity the life of a hermit could be among the most important types of human life. And the concept of friendship has itself undergone continuous later transformations. But in Sophocles' world, where so much is contestable that friendship, companionship, and citizenship are essential aspects of humanity, is not contestable. And in this, at least, Sophocles is at one with the rest of the Athenian world. The common Athenian assumption, then, is that the virtues have their place within the social context of the city-state. To be a good man will on every Greek view be at least closely allied to being a good citizen. What are the virtues which make the good man and the good citizen, and what are the corresponding vices? When Isocrates praised Pericles, he described him as excelling all other citizens in being sophron and dikaios and sophos. Orators and comic poets generally denounce meanness and lack of generosity. It is a Greek commonplace that the free man tells the truth fearlessly and takes responsibility for his actions. Some writers praise simplicity of character and straightforwardness. Lack of sensitivity and lack of piety are often condemned. So is boorishness. Courage is always praised. But if these are some of the most important virtues, what is it that makes them virtues? There is a danger that we shall be misled in trying to answer this question, either if we attend only to those qualities which we too take to be virtues, or, as I have already suggested, if we ignore the extent to which Greeks disagree with one another. So, I begin by doing two things. One is to note that humility, thrift, and conscientiousness could appear in no Greek list of the virtues. The other is to stress once more the alternative interpretations of one and the same virtue which were possible. Consider not only honor and justice, but the virtue whose name is sophrosune. In origin, it is an aristocratic virtue. It is the virtue of the man who could but does not abuse his power. One part of such restraint is the ability to control one's passions, and when the word is applied to women, and sophrosune is for the Greeks the womanly virtue, the ability and only that is commonly what is being praised. But very clearly, this is not what Isocrates was primarily praising in Pericles. Indeed, Isocrates' praise of Pericles as sophron must be recognized as compatible with the acknowledgment of those qualities which, in Thucydides' version, Pericles himself ascribed to the Athenians: incessant activity in the pursuit of their own interests, a drive to do more and to push further. Thus, sophrosune on this view does not necessarily imply restraint so far as one's goals are concerned. It is rather restraint in the manner of realizing these goals that is being praised, the quality of knowing how far to go on a particular occasion and when to pause or temporarily draw back. So that sophrosune can now be at home with the polypragmosune of the Athenian democracy, as well as with the aristocratic ideals of restraint and of besoukia leisure. Yet the ideals of polypragmosune and the besoukia are certainly themselves sharply opposed, so that sophrosune has now found a place not just in two different, but in two incompatible moral schemes. In what ways are polypragmosune and besoukia opposed? Hesoukia appears in Pindar, Pythian Odes 8.1, as the name of a goddess. She represents that peacefulness of spirit to which the victor in a contest is entitled when he is at rest afterwards. Respect for her is bound up with the notion that we strive in order to be at rest, rather than in order to struggle ceaselessly from goal to goal, from desire to desire. Polypragmosune, by contrast, is not merely a matter of being busy about many things, but a quality in which pride comes to be taken. The Athenian milieu in which it is at home is one in which pleonexia also comes naturally enough to be at home. Pleonexia is sometimes translated so as to make it appear that the vice which it picks out is simply that of wanting more than one share. This is how J.S. Mill translated it, and to follow Mill is to diminish the gap between the ancient world and modern individualism. For we have no problem, how could anyone have a problem, with the thought that it is wrong to take more than one share? But in fact, the vice picked out is that of acquisitiveness as such, a quality that modern individualism, both in its economic activity and in the character of the consuming aesthete, does not perceive to be a vice at all. Nietzsche translated pleonexia with insight as well as precision. Beben und mir wohl buben. Because in the modern world, as we shall later see, the notion that the wish to have more simplicator acquisitiveness as such might be a vice was increasingly lost sight of. Hence, presumably, Mill's misunderstanding, for in fact pleonexia is the name of just that vice. For those possessed by pleonexia, the agon, the contest, becomes something quite other than it was in the games or for Pindar. It becomes an instrument of the individual will in grasping after success, in satisfying its desires. Of course, in any society where contests are central to activity, the victor will achieve the prizes of success and will at least appear to be, and will probably in fact be, nearer than others to satisfying his desires. But the achievement and the excellence recognized by himself, by the community, and by such people as the poet whose task it is to praise that achievement and that excellence, are what is valued primarily. It is because they are valued that prizes and satisfactions attach to them, not vice versa. Consider now the place of the agon, the contest, in classical Greek society. The Homeric epics are narratives which recount a series of contests. In the Iliad, the character of these contests is gradually transformed until it is acknowledged in the confrontation between Achilles and Priam, that to win is also to lose, and that in fact in the face of death, winning and losing no longer divide. This is the first great enunciation of moral truth in Greek culture, and later we shall have to consider its status as truth. For the moment, we need only note that it was in the context of the agon that truth had to be discovered. The agon, of course, changes its character. First, in the Olympic Games, the actual wars between city-states were suspended by a truce every 4 years from 1776 BC onward, and every Greek community, no matter how widely scattered, aspired to send representatives. Wrestling, running, horse racing, and the discus were celebrated by the praise of poetry and sculpture. Around this center there grew up other practices. Olympia, originally and always a shrine of Zeus, became an archive where records were kept and treatises preserved. The implicit definition of a Greek, as contrasted with a barbarian, becomes a member of a community entitled to attend the Olympic Games. But the agon is a central institution not only in unifying all Greeks from their different city-states. It is also central within each city-state, a context in which once again the form of the agon changes. Among the contests into which it is transformed are the debates in the assemblies and law courts of Greek democracy, the conflicts at the heart of tragedy, a piece of symbolic and very serious buffoonery in the plot line of comedy, and finally the dialogue form of philosophical argument. In understanding each of these as a manifestation of the Agon, we ought to recognize that the categories political, dramatic, philosophical were much more intimately related in the Athenian world than in our own. Politics and philosophy were shaped by dramatic form. The preoccupations of drama were philosophical and political. Philosophy had to make its claims in the arena of the political and the dramatic. At Athens, the audience for each was potentially largely and actually to some degree one and the same, and the audience itself was a collective actor. The producer of drama was a holder of political office. The philosopher risked comic portrayal and political punishment. The Athenians had not insulated, as we have by a set of institutional devices, the pursuit of political ends from dramatic representation, or the asking of philosophic questions from either. Hence we lack, as they did not, any public, generally shared communal mode either for representing political conflict or for putting our politics to the philosophical question. It will be important later to notice more precisely how these possibilities were closed to us. But for the moment, enough has been said to return to the central question. We have noticed in turn that different and rival lists of virtues, different and rival attitudes towards the virtues, and different and rival definitions of individual virtues are at home in 5th century Athens, and that nonetheless the city-state and the Agon provide the shared contexts in which the virtues are to be exercised. Just because these rivalries and inconsistencies are symptoms of conflict, it is scarcely surprising that rival and competing philosophical accounts of the virtues appear, making overt and explicit the underlying conflicts. Of these, perhaps the simplest and most radical is that of a certain type of sophist. A.W.H. Atkins has noticed the resemblance between Thrasymachus, as portrayed by Plato, and the cruder versions of the Homeric hero. Scratch Thrasymachus, and you find Agamemnon. Agamemnon is the prototype of the Homeric hero who has never learnt the truth that the Iliad was written to teach. He wants only to win and to have the fruits of victory for himself. Everyone else is to be used or overcome. Epignia, Briseis, Achilles. So the sophist of whom Plato's Thrasymachus is the type makes success the only goal of action and makes the acquisition of power to do and get whatever one wants the entire content of success. A virtue is then naturally enough defined as a quality which will ensure success. But success for the sophists, as for other Greeks, must be success in some particular city. Hence, the ethics of success come to be combined with a certain kind of relativism. To be successful is to be successful in a particular city, but in different cities there may be different conceptions of the virtues. What is taken to be just in democratic Athens may be different from what is taken to be just in aristocratic Thebes or in military Sparta. The sophistic conclusion is that in each particular city the virtues are what they are taken to be in that city. There is no such thing as justice as such, but only justice as understood in Athens, and justice as understood in Thebes, and justice as understood at Sparta. This relativism, when combined with the view that a virtue is a quality which leads to individual success, involves its adherents in a number of related difficulties. Part of the original impulse behind the sophistic view seems to have been the wish to provide a consistent and coherent redefinition of the central evaluative expressions in 5th century Greek as a basis for educating the young, particularly the aristocratic young, for political success. But the achievement of a certain degree of consistency by elevating competitive conceptions and definitions of the virtues above the cooperative ones turns out to have generated inconsistency at other points. By accepting the evaluative vocabulary of his own particular city, the sophist will sometimes find himself using expressions which themselves embody a non-relativistic standpoint inconsistent with the relativism which led him to use that vocabulary. And the sophist who has redefined expressions such as just, virtue, and good, so that they refer to qualities which are conducive to individual success, but who also wishes to employ the conventional vocabulary in order to achieve that success, may well find himself in one situation praising justice, because by the term justice nothing more is to be meant than what is to the interest of the stronger, and in another praising injustice over justice because it is the practice of injustice, as conventionally understood, which is in fact to the interest of the stronger. There is, of course, nothing in this type of sophistic tradition which makes it necessary for someone who holds it to be trapped in this kind of inconsistency, and so become the victim of his opponents in debate. But inconsistency could only be escaped by a more radical redefinition of the virtues than many sophists were prepared to embark upon. So in Plato's Gorgias, Gorgias himself and his pupil Polus are successively defeated in argument by Socrates as a result of this kind of inconsistency, where Callicles cannot be so defeated. For Callicles is prepared to carry through a systematic statement of his standpoint, whatever the deductive consequences and whatever the degree of the breach with ordinary moral usage. That standpoint is one which glorifies the man who uses his intelligence to dominate and who uses his domination to satisfy his desires without limit. Socrates is able to raise difficulties for this view, but none of them is conclusive in the way his objections to Gorgias and Polus had been. Thus Callicles does seem to succeed in providing one way of resolving the incoherences of the ordinary Greek mind. Are there good reasons why we should not accept that resolution? Some later writers, Stoic in the ancient world, Kantian in the modern, have supposed that the only possible answer to Callicles lies in arguing for the severance of all connection between what is good, or, as modern writers would say, morally good, and human desires. They take it that if what we ought to do is also what satisfies our desires, then Callicles must be in the right. Plato, of course, does not attack Callicles from this standpoint. Indeed, it is doubtful if any 5th or 4th century Greek could have done so in a systematic way. For Plato, and in this at least both Plato and Callicles agree with ordinary Greek usage, as well as with each other, accepts the view that the concepts of virtue and goodness on the one hand and those of happiness, success, and fulfillment of desire on the other are indissolubly linked. He cannot therefore challenge Callicles' view that what is good will lead to happiness and the satisfaction of desire. Instead, he has to challenge Callicles' conceptions of happiness and of the satisfaction of desire. It is the need to sustain this latter challenge that leads straight to the psychology of the Phaedo and of the Republic, and the psychology of those dialogues provides the basis for a rival conception of and an accompanying list of the virtues. If, for Callicles, the satisfaction of desire is to be found in domination over a polis, in the life of a tyrant, for Plato, rational desire could be genuinely satisfied in no polis that actually existed in the physical world, but only in an ideal state with an ideal constitution. Thus, the good to which rational desire aspires and the actual life of the city-state have to be sharply distinguished. What is politically attainable is unsatisfying. What is satisfying is attainable only by philosophy and not by politics. The former lesson Plato finally learnt in Sicily, and doubtless he felt that he ought to have learnt it once and for all from the death of Socrates. Nevertheless, the concept of virtue remains a political concept, for Plato's account of the virtuous man is inseparable from his account of the virtuous citizen. Indeed, this is an understatement. There is no way to be excellent as a man which does not involve excellence as a citizen, and vice versa. But the excellent citizen will not be at home in any actual city, in Athens or Thebes or even in Sparta. In none of these places are those who rule the city themselves ruled by reason. What does reason enjoin? That each part of the soul shall perform its specific function. The exercise of each specific function is a particular virtue. So the bodily appetites are to accept the restraint imposed by reason. The virtue thus exhibited is sophrosune. That high-spirited virtue which responds to the challenge of danger, when it responds as reason bids it, exhibits itself as courage, andraia. Reason itself, when it has been disciplined by mathematical and dialectical inquiry, so that it is able to discern what justice itself is, what beauty itself is, and above all the other forms what the form of the good is, exhibits its own specific virtue of Sophia, wisdom. These three virtues can only be exhibited when a fourth, the virtue of dikaiosune, is also exhibited. For dikaiosune, which on Plato's account is very different from any of our modern conceptions of justice, although the term justice is the translation used by almost all of Plato's translators, is precisely the virtue of allocating each part of the soul its particular function, and no other. Plato's account and redefinition of the virtues is thus derived from a complex theory, a theory without which we will be unable to grasp what a virtue is. He both rejects and tries to explain what his theory must envisage as the ordinary Greek's inadequate linguistic usage and corrupted practice. When certain of the Sophists translate the variety and the inconsistencies of ordinary use into a would-be consistent relativism, Plato rejects not only the relativism and the inconsistency, but also the variety. I emphasized earlier that Plato's theory links the virtues to the political practice of an ideal rather than an actual state. It is important also to emphasize that Plato claims for his theory an ability to explain the conflicts and disharmonies of actual states, as well as the harmony and disharmony of actual personalities. In both the political and the personal realm, conflict and virtue are mutually incompatible and exclusive. This is perhaps one source of Plato's view that dramatic art is an enemy of virtue. Certainly there are other sources for Plato's view, that is, his metaphysics leads him to treat all mimesis, all representation, as a movement away from genuine reality into illusion, and his view of the didactic effect of art makes him disapprove of the content of much epic and dramatic poetry. But he is also deeply committed to the view that both within the city and within the person, virtue cannot be in conflict with virtue. There cannot be rival goods at war with each other, yet it is just what Plato takes to be impossible which makes tragic drama possible. Tragic drama had very early explored the conflicts that would arise within a post-Homeric framework. Aeschylus relied on the contradictory imperatives of kinship loyalties and the equally contradictory imperatives of the theology that sustained kinship. But it is Sophocles who systematically explores rival allegiances to incorruptible goods, especially in the Antigone and the Philocetes, in a way that raises a key and complex set of questions about the virtues. It seems to be clear that there can be rival conceptions of the virtues, rival accounts of what a virtue is, and it seems to be equally clear that there can be disputes over whether a particular quality is to be accounted as a virtue or a vice. But it might, of course, be argued that in all such disagreements, at least one party to the argument is simply mistaken, and that we can rationally settle all disputes and arrive at a single rationally justifiable account of and list of the virtues. Suppose, indeed, for the moment that this were so. Could it then be the case that in certain circumstances, at least, the possession of one virtue might exclude the possession of some other? Could one virtue be temporarily, at least, at war with another, and both qualities genuinely be accorded virtues? Can the exercise of the virtue of doing what is required of a sister, Antigone, or a friend, Odysseus, be at odds with the exercise of the virtues of justice, Creon, or of compassion and truthfulness, Neoptolemus? We inherit two systematic sets of answers to such questions. The ancestor of one of these sets of answers is Plato, for whom, as we have seen, the virtues are not merely compatible with each other, but the presence of each requires the presence of all. This strong thesis concerning the unity of the virtues is reiterated both by Aristotle and by Aquinas, even though they differ from Plato and from each other in a number of important ways. The presupposition which all three share is that there exists a cosmic order which dictates the place of each virtue in a total harmonious scheme of human life. Truth in the moral sphere consists in the conformity of moral judgment to the order of this scheme. There is a sharply contrasting modern tradition which holds that the variety and heterogeneity of human goods is such that their pursuit cannot be reconciled in any single moral order, and that consequently any social order which either attempts such a reconciliation or which enforces the hegemony of one set of goods over all others is bound to turn into a straitjacket, and very probably a totalitarian straitjacket, for the human condition. This is a view which Sir Isaiah Berlin has urged upon us strenuously, and its ancestry, as we noted earlier, is in Weber's writings. I take it that this view entails a heterogeneity of the virtues as well as of goods in general, and that choice between rival claims in respect of the virtues has the same central place in the moral life for such theorists that choice between goods in general does. And where judgments express choices of this kind, we cannot characterize them as either true or false. The interest of Sophocles lies in his presentation of a view equally difficult for a Platonist or a Weberian to accept. There are indeed crucial conflicts in which different virtues appear as making rival and incompatible claims upon us. But our situation is tragic in that we have to recognize the authority of both claims. There is an objective moral order, but our perceptions of it are such that we cannot bring rival moral truths into complete harmony with each other, and yet the acknowledgment of the moral order and of moral truth makes the kind of choice which a Weber or a Berlin urges upon us out of the question. For to choose does not exempt me from the authority of the claim which I choose to go against. In the conflicts of Sophoclean tragedy, therefore, the attempt at resolution unsurprisingly invokes an appeal and a verdict by some god. But the divine verdict always ends rather than resolves the conflict. It leaves unbridged the gap between the acknowledgment of authority, of a cosmic order, and of the claims to truth involved in the recognition of the virtues on the one hand, and our particular perceptions and judgments in particular situations on the other. It is worth recalling that this aspect of the Sophoclean view is only part of his account of the virtues, an account which has two other central characteristics which I have already noted. The first is that the moral protagonist stands in a relationship to his community and his social roles which is neither the same as that of the epic hero, nor again the same as that of modern individualism. For like the epic hero, the Sophoclean protagonist would be nothing without his or her place in the social order, in the family, the city, the army at Troy. He or she is what society takes him to be, but he or she is not only what society takes him or her to be. He or she both belongs to a place in the social order and transcends it, and he or she does so precisely by encountering and acknowledging the kind of conflict which I have just identified. Secondly, the life of the Sophoclean protagonist has its own specific narrative form, just as that of the epic hero had. I am not here making the trivial and obvious point that Sophoclean protagonists are characters in plays. I am rather ascribing to Sophocles a belief analogous to that which Anne Reiter in 1962 has ascribed to Shakespeare, that he portrayed human life in dramatic narratives because he took it that human life already had the form of dramatic narrative, and indeed the form of one specific type of dramatic narrative. Hence, I take it also that the difference between the heroic account of the virtues and the Sophoclean accounts amounts precisely to a difference over what narrative form captures best the central characteristics of human life and agency. And this suggests an hypothesis. That is, that generally to adopt a stance on the virtues will be to adopt a stance on the narrative character of human life. Why this might be so is easy to understand. If a human life is understood as a progress through harms and dangers, moral and physical, which someone may encounter and overcome in better and worse ways, and with a greater or lesser measure of success, the virtues will find their place as those qualities the possession and exercise of which generally tend to success in this enterprise, and the vices likewise as qualities which likewise tend to failure. Each human life will then embody a story whose shape and form will depend upon what is counted as harm and danger, and upon how success and failure progress, and its opposite are understood and evaluated. To answer these questions will also explicitly and implicitly be to answer the question as to what the virtues and vices are. The answer to this linked set of questions, given by the poets of heroic society, is not the same as that given by Sophocles, but the link is the same in both, and it reveals how belief in the virtues being of a certain kind and belief in human life exhibiting a certain narrative order are internally connected. The nature of this connection is reinforced by a further consideration. A little earlier, I contrasted the Sophoclean view of the virtues with that taken by Plato on the one hand and Weberian individualists on the other. and in each of these cases the account of the virtues is closely linked to attitudes to the narrative form of human life. Plato has to expel the dramatic poets from the Republic because in part of the rivalry between their view and his. It has been justly remarked that the Republic itself, like some of its predecessor dialogues, is a dramatic poem, but the dramatic form is not that of tragedy, is not Sophoclean. And for the Weberian individualist life of itself has in this sense no form, save that which we choose to project on it in our aesthetic imaginings. But such points must for the present be put on one side. Instead, it is necessary to amplify the Sophoclean view in two ways. The first is to emphasize once more what is at stake in Sophoclean dramatic encounter is not simply the fate of individuals. When Antigone and Creon contend, the life of the clan and the life of the city are weighted against each other. When Odysseus and Philocetes confront each other, it is the outcome for the Greek community which is in the balance. It is the individual in his or her role representing his or her community who is, as in epic, the dramatic character. Hence, in some important sense, the community too is a dramatic character which enacts the narrative of its history. Secondly, and correlatively, the Sophoclean self differs from the emotivist self as much as does the heroic self, although in more complex ways. The Sophoclean self transcends the limitations of social roles and is able to put those roles in question. But it remains accountable to the point of death and accountable precisely for the way in which it handles itself in those conflicts which make the heroic point of view no longer possible. Thus, the presupposition of the Sophoclean self's existence is that it can indeed win or lose, save itself or go to moral destruction, that there is an order which requires from us the pursuits of certain ends, an order relationship to which provides our judgments with the property of truth or falsity. But is there such an order? We can no longer delay turning away from poetry to philosophy, from Sophocles to Aristotle. Chapter 12. Aristotle's account of the virtues. Any attempt to treat Aristotle's account of the virtues from the standpoint which I have adopted presents me with an initial problem. On the one hand, he is the protagonist against whom I have matched the voices of liberal modernity. So I am clearly committed to giving his own highly specific account of the virtues a central place. On the other hand, I have already made it clear that I want to regard him not just as an individual theorist, but as the representative of a long tradition, as someone who articulates what a number of predecessors and successors also articulate with varying degrees of success. And to treat Aristotle as part of a tradition, even as its greatest representative, is a very un-Aristotelian thing to do. Aristotle, of course, recognized that he had predecessors. Indeed, he tried to write the history of previous philosophy. Previous philosophy in such a way that it culminated with his own thought. But he envisioned the relationship of that thought to those predecessors in terms of the replacement of their errors, or at least partial truths, by his comprehensively true account. From the standpoint of truth, on Aristotle's own view, once his work has been done, theirs could be discarded without loss. But to think in this way is to exclude the notion of a tradition of thought, at least as I intend it. For it is central to the conception of such a tradition that the past is never something merely to be discarded, but rather that the present is intelligible only as a commentary upon and response to the past, in which the past, if necessary and if possible, is corrected and transcended, yet corrected and transcended in a way that leaves the present open to being in turn corrected and transcended by some yet more adequate future point of view. Thus, the notion of a tradition embodies a very un-Aristotelian theory of knowledge, according to which each particular theory or set of moral or scientific beliefs is intelligible and justifiable, insofar as it is justifiable only as a member of an historical series. It is scarcely necessary to say that in such a series the latter is not necessarily superior to the earlier. A tradition may cease to progress or may degenerate. But when a tradition is in good order, when progress is taking place, there is always a certain cumulative element to a tradition. Not everything in the present is equally liable to be overthrown in the future, and some elements of present theory or belief may be such that it is difficult to envisage their being abandoned without the tradition as a whole being discarded. So it is, for example, in our present-day scientific tradition with the account of the relationship between cells and molecules in contemporary biochemistry, and so it is with Aristotle's account of some central virtues within the classical tradition. Aristotle's importance, therefore, can only be specified in terms of a kind of tradition whose existence he himself did not and could not have acknowledged. And just as the absence of any sense of the specifically historical, in our sense, in Aristotle, as in other Greek thinkers, debars Aristotle from recognizing his own thought as part of a tradition, it also severely limits what he can say about narrative. Hence, the task of integrating what Aristotle had to say about the virtues with the kind of thesis about the relationship between virtues and forms of narratives which I have suggested is present in epic and tragic writers has to wait, a very long wait, for successors to Aristotle whose biblical culture has educated them to think historically. Some questions central to the classical tradition can receive no answer from Aristotle himself. Nonetheless, it is Aristotle whose account of the virtues decisively constitutes the classical tradition as a tradition of moral thought, firmly establishing a good deal that his poetic predecessors had only been able to assert or suggest, and making the classical tradition a rational tradition, without surrendering to Plato's pessimism about the social world. Yet we ought also to note at the outset that we possess Aristotle's thought in a form which itself makes scholarly and sometimes unsettlable debate over the content of that thought unavoidable. Moreover, it has been recently argued, by Kenny in 1978, that it is the Eudaimenean ethics and not, as almost every scholar has believed, in the Nicomachean ethics, that Aristotle's mature positions are to be found. The debate over this contention will continue, see Irwin 1980, but happily I need not enter into it. For the tradition within which I am placing Aristotle was one which made the Nicomachean ethics the canonical text for Aristotle's account of the virtues. The Nicomachean ethics, dedicated to Aristotle's son Nicomachus, says Porphyry, edited by him, says others, is the most brilliant set of lecture notes ever written. And just because they are lecture notes, with all the disadvantages of occasional compression or repetition or inaccurate cross-referencing, we can almost hear in them from time to time the tone of Aristotle's spoken voice. It is magisterial and it is unique, but it is also a voice that seeks to be more than merely Aristotle's own. Quote, "What do we say on such and such a topic?" is a question that he continually asks, not "What do I say?" Who is this we in whose name he writes? Aristotle takes himself not to be inventing an account of the virtues, but to be articulating an account that is implicit in the thought, utterance, and action of an educated Athenian. He seeks to be the rational voice of the best citizens of the best city-state, for he holds that the city-state is the unique political form in which alone the virtues of human life can be genuinely and fully exhibited. Thus, a philosophical theory of the virtues is a theory whose subject matter is that pre-philosophical theory already implicit in and presupposed by the best contemporary practice of the virtues. This, of course, does not entail that practice and the pre-philosophical theory implicit in practice are normative, for philosophy necessarily has a sociological, or as Aristotle would have said, political starting point. Every activity, every inquiry, every practice aims at some good, for by the good, or a good, we mean that at which human beings characteristically aim. It is important that Aristotle's initial arguments in the Ethics presuppose what G.E. Moore was to call the so-called naturalistic fallacy. It is important that Aristotle's initial arguments in the Ethics presuppose that what G.E. Moore was to call the so-called naturalistic fallacy is not a fallacy at all, and that statements about what is good and what is just or courageous or excellent in other ways are just a kind of factual statement. Human beings, like the members of all other species, have a specific nature, and that nature is such that they have certain aims and goals, such that they move by nature towards a specific telos. The good is defined in terms of their specific characteristics. Hence, Aristotle's Ethics, expounded as he expounds it, presupposes his metaphysical biology. Aristotle thus sets himself to the task of giving an account of the good, which is at once local and particular, located in and partially defined by the characteristics of the polis, and yet also cosmic and universal. The tension between these poles is felt throughout the argument of the Ethics. What then does the good for man turn out to be? Aristotle has cogent arguments against identifying that good with money, with honor, or with pleasure. He gives to it the name of eudaimonia, as so often there is a difficulty in translation. Blessedness, happiness, prosperity. It is the state of being well and doing well in being well, of a man's being well favored himself and in relation to the divine. But when Aristotle first gives this name to the good for man, he leaves the question of the content of eudaimonia largely open. The virtues are precisely those qualities the possession of which will enable an individual to achieve eudaimonia, and the lack of which will frustrate his movement towards that telos. But although it would not be incorrect to describe the exercise of virtues as means to the end of achieving the good for man, that description is ambiguous. Aristotle does not in his writings explicitly distinguish between two different types of means-end relationship. When we speak of any happening or state or activity as a means to some other, we may on the one hand mean that the world as a matter of contingent fact so ordered that When we speak of any happening, or state, or activity as a means to some other, we may on the one hand mean that the world is, as a matter of fact, so ordered that you are able to bring about a happening or state of activity of the first kind. An event or state or activity of the second kind will ensue. This means, and the end can each be adequately characterized without reference to the other, and a number of quite different means may be employed to achieve one and the same end. But the exercise of the virtues is not, in this sense, a means to the end of the good for man. For what constitutes the good for man is a complete human life lived at its best, and the exercise of the virtues is a necessary and central part of such a life, not a mere preparatory exercise to secure such a life. We thus cannot characterize the good for man adequately without already having made reference to the virtues. And within an Aristotelian framework, the suggestion, therefore, is that there might be some means to achieve the good for man without the exercise of the virtues makes no sense. The immediate outcome of the exercise of a virtue is a choice which issues in right action. Thus Aristotle says, quote, "It is the correctness of the end of the purposive choice of which virtue is the cause." 1228a, line 1, Kinney's translation, Kinney, 1978. Wrote Aristotle in the Eudaimean Ethics. It does not, of course, follow that in the absence of the relevant virtue, an action may not be done. To understand why, consider Aristotle's answer to the question, what would someone be like who lacked to some large degree an adequate training in the virtues of character? In part, this would depend on his natural traits and talents. Some individuals have an inherited natural disposition to do on occasion what a particular virtue requires. But this happy gift of fortune is not to be confused with the possession of the corresponding virtue, for just because it is not informed by systematic training and by principle, even such fortunate individuals will be the prey of their own emotions and desires. This victimization by one's own emotions and desires would be of more than one kind. On the one hand, one would lack any means of ordering one's emotions and desires, of deciding rationally which to cultivate and encourage, which to inhibit and reduce. On the other hand, on particular occasions, one would lack those dispositions which enable a desire for something other than what is actually one's good to be held in check. Virtues are dispositions not only to act in particular ways, but also to feel in particular ways. To act virtuously is not, as Kant was later to think, to act against inclination. It is to act from inclination formed by the cultivation of the virtues. Moral education is an education sentimentale. The educated moral agent must of course know what he is doing when he judges or acts virtuously. Thus he does what is virtuous because it is virtuous. It is this fact that distinguishes the exercise of the virtues from the exercise of certain qualities which are not virtues, but rather simulacra of virtues. The well-trained soldier, for instance, may do what courage would have demanded in a particular situation, but not because he is courageous, but because he is well-trained, or, perhaps, to go beyond Aristotle's example by remembering Friedrich the Great's maxim, because he is more frightened of his own officers than he is of the enemy. The genuinely virtuous agent, however, acts on the basis of a true and rational judgment. An Aristotelian theory of the virtues does therefore presuppose a crucial distinction between what any particular individual at any particular time takes to be good for him and what is really good for him as a man. It is for the sake of achieving this latter good that we practice the virtues, and we do so by making choices about means to achieve that end, means in both senses characterized earlier. Such choices demand judgment, and the exercise of the virtues requires therefore a capacity to judge and to do the right thing in the right place, at the right time, in the right way. The exercise of such judgment is not a routinizable application of rules. Hence, perhaps the most obvious and astonishing absence from Aristotle's thought for any modern reader, that is, there is relatively little mention of rules anywhere in the Ethics. Moreover, Aristotle takes that part of morality which is obedience to rules to be obedience to laws enacted by the city-state, if and when the city-state enacts as it ought. Such law prescribes and prohibits certain types of action absolutely, and such actions are among those which a virtuous man would do or refrain from doing. Hence, it is a crucial part of Aristotle's view that certain types of action are absolutely prohibited or enjoined irrespective of circumstances or consequences. Aristotle's view is teleological, but it is not consequentialist. Moreover, the examples Aristotle gives of what is absolutely prohibited resemble the precepts of what is at first sight a completely different kind of moral system, that is, of the Jewish law. What he says about the law is very brief, although he does insist that there are natural and universal as well as conventional and local rules of justice. It seems likely that he means to insist that natural and universal justice absolutely prohibits certain types of act, but that which the penalties are assigned to which offense may vary from city to city. Nevertheless, what he says on this topic is so brief as to be cryptic. It therefore seems worth asking in a more general way, rather than imputing to Aristotle views that would go far beyond what is in the text, how it might be that such views as Aristotle's on the place of the virtues in human life should require some reference to the absolute prohibitions of natural justice. And in asking this question, it is worth remembering Aristotle's insistence that the virtues find their place not just in the life of the individual, but in the life of the city, and that the individual is indeed intelligible only as a politikon zoon, that is, a political living animal. This last remark suggests that one way to elucidate the relationship between virtues on the one hand and a morality of laws on the other is to consider what would be involved in any age in founding a community to achieve a common project, to bring about some good recognized as their shared good by all those engaging in the project. As modern examples of such a project, we might consider the founding and carrying forward of a school, a hospital, or an art gallery. In the ancient world, the characteristic examples would have been those of a religious cult, or of an expedition, or of a city. Those who participated in such a project would need to develop two quite different types of evaluative practice. On the one hand, they would need to value, to praise as excellences, those qualities of mind and character which would contribute to the realization of their common good or goods. That is, they would need to recognize a certain set of qualities as virtues and the corresponding set of defects as vices. They would also need, however, to identify certain types of action as the doing or the production of harm of such an order that they destroy the bonds of community in such a way as to render the doing or achieving of good impossible in some respect, at least for some time. Examples of such offenses would characteristically be the taking of innocent life, theft, and perjury, and betrayal. The table of the virtues promulgated in such a community would teach its citizens what kinds of actions would gain them merit and honor. The table of legal offenses would teach them what kinds of actions would be regarded not simply as bad, but as intolerable. The response to such offenses would have to be that of taking the person who committed them to have thereby excluded himself or herself from the community. A violation of the bonds of community by the offender has to be recognized for what it is by the community, if the community is not itself to fail. Hence, the offender, in one crucial sense, has excluded him or herself, has by his or her own action invited punishment. Whether the exclusion were permanent, by way of execution or irrevocable exile, or temporary, by way of imprisonment or exile for a term, would depend upon the gravity of the particular offense. A broad measure of agreement on a scale of gravity of offenses would be partially constitutive of such a community, as would be a similar broad measure of agreement on the nature and importances of the various virtues. The need for both these types of practices arises from the fact that an individual member of such a community could fail in his role as a member of that community in two quite different ways. He could, on the one hand, simply fail to be good enough. That is, he could be deficient in the virtues to such an extent as to render his contribution to the achievement of the community's common good negligible. But someone could fail in this way without committing any of the particular offenses specified in the community's laws. Indeed, it might be precisely because of his vices that someone abstained from committing offenses. Cowardice can be someone's reason for not committing murder. Vanity and boastfulness can on occasion lead someone to tell the truth. Conversely, to fail the community by committing an offense against the law is not simply to fail by not being good enough. It is to fail in a quite different way. Indeed, although someone who possesses the virtues to a high degree will be far less apt than others to commit grave offenses, a brave and modest man may on occasion commit murder, and his offense is no less and no more than the offense of a coward or a braggart. To do positive wrong is not the same as to be defective in doing or being good. Nonetheless, the two kinds of failure are intimately related, for both injure the community to some degree and make its shared project less likely to be successful. An offense against the laws destroys those relationships which make common pursuit of the good possible. Defective character, while it may also render someone more liable to commit offenses, makes one able to contribute to the achievement of that good without which the community's common life has no point. Both are bad because deprivations of good, but deprivations of very different kinds, so that an account of the virtues, while an essential part of an account of the moral life of such a community, could never be complete by itself. And Aristotle, as we have seen, recognizes that his account of the virtue has to be supplemented by some account, even if a brief one, of those types of actions which are absolutely prohibited. There is, however, another crucial link between the virtues and law, for knowing how to apply the law is itself possible only for someone who possesses the virtue of justice. To be just is to give each person what each deserves, and the social presuppositions of the flourishing of the virtue of justice in a community are therefore twofold. That is, that there are rational criteria of desert, and that there is socially established agreement as to what those criteria are. A great part of the assignation of goods and penalties in accordance with desert is of course rule governed. But the distribution of public office within the city and the retribution according to criminal acts are to be specified by the laws of the city. Notice how, on an Aristotelian view, law and morality are not two separate realms. They are as they are for modernity. But partly because laws are general, particular cases will always arise in which it is unclear how the law is to be applied and unclear what justice demands. Thus, there are bound to be occasions on which no formula is available in advance. It is on such occasions that we have to act kata ton orthon logon, or according to right reason. Nicomachean Ethics, 1138b, line 25. A phrase misleadingly translated by W.D. Ross as in accordance with the right rule. This misreading by someone who is usually a meticulous translator of Aristotle is perhaps not important, for it reflects the large and un-Aristotelian preoccupation with rules of modern moral philosophers. What Aristotle seems to mean here can be usefully illustrated by a contemporary example. There is, at the time at which I am writing, a lawsuit in progress between the Wampanoag Indian tribe and the town of Mashpee, Massachusetts. The Wampanoag Indians claimed that their tribal lands in the township were illegally and unconstitutionally appropriated, and they are suing for their return. The case has since been decided against the Wampanoag by a jury verdict notable only for its incoherence. The claim has been quite some time coming to court, and the hearings themselves will not be over soon. The party who loses in the lower court will almost certainly appeal to the process of appeal, and the process of appeal is extended. During this long period, property values in Mashpee have fallen drastically, and it is for the moment almost impossible to sell certain types of property at all. This creates hardship generally for homeowners and more especially for certain classes of homeowners. For example, retired people who had legitimately expected to be able to sell their property and move elsewhere, relying on the proceeds of the sale to reestablish their lives, perhaps nearer their children. What in this type of situation does justice demand? We ought to note that two rule-specified concepts of justice recently advanced by contemporary moral philosophers can give us no help at all. John Rawls argues that, quote, social and economic inequalities are to be arranged so that they are to the greatest benefit of the least advantaged, page 302. And Robert Nozick asserts that the holdings of a person are just if he is entitled to them by the principles of justice in acquisition and transfer, page 135. But the problem in Mashpee concerns a period of time in which we do not as yet know either who has a just title by acquisition and transfer, for precisely that is to be decided by the current legal case, or which is the least advantaged group in Mashpee, for that will be determined as a consequence of the outcome of the case. If it goes one way, the Wampanoag will turn out to be the richest group in Mashpee, but if the other, they will remain the poorest. Nonetheless, a just solution has been devised by the tribal claimants, a solution to which, after an apparent initial agreement, the selectmen of Mashpee refused their assent. This is, that all properties of 1 acre or less on which a dwelling house stands shall be exempted from the suit. It would be difficult to represent this as in any way the application of a rule. Indeed, it had to be devised because no application of the rules could afford small homeowners justice. The solution is the result of rough and ready reasoning involving such considerations as the proportion of the land claimed which comprises such properties, and the number of people affected, if the size of property exempted were fixed at 1 acre rather than more or less. To judge kata ton orthon logon is indeed to judge of more or less, and Aristotle tries to use the notion of a mean between the more or less to give a general characterization of the virtues. Courage lies between rashness and timidity. justice between doing injustice and suffering injustice, liberality between prodigality and meanness. For each virtue, therefore, there are two corresponding vices, and what it is to fall into a vice cannot be adequately specified independently of circumstances. The very same action, which would in one situation be liberality, could in another be prodigality, and in a third meanness. Hence, judgment has an indispensable role in the life of the virtuous man, which it does not and could not have in, for example, the life of a merely law-abiding or rule-abiding man. A central virtue, therefore, is phronesis. Phronesis, like sophrosune, is originally an aristocratic term of praise. It characterizes someone who knows what is due to him, who takes pride in claiming his due. It comes to mean more generally someone who knows how to exercise judgment in particular cases. Phronesis is an intellectual virtue, but it is that intellectual virtue without which none of the virtues of character can be exercised. Aristotle's distinction between these two kinds of virtue is initially made in terms of a contrast between the ways in which they are acquired. Intellectual virtues are acquired through teaching, the virtues of character from habitual exercise. We become just or courageous by performing just or courageous acts. We become theoretically or practically wise as a result of systematic instruction. Nonetheless, these two kinds of moral education are intimately related. As we transform our initial naturally given dispositions into virtues of character, we do so by gradually coming to exercise those dispositions kata ton orthon logon. The exercise of intelligence is what makes the crucial difference between a natural disposition of a certain kind and the corresponding virtue. Conversely, the exercise of practical intelligence requires the presence of the virtues of character. Otherwise, it degenerates into, or remains from the outset, merely a certain cunning capacity for linking means to any end, rather than to those ends which are genuine goods for man. According to Aristotle, then, excellence of character and intelligence cannot be separated. Here, Aristotle expresses a view characteristically at odds with that dominant in the modern world. The modern view is expressed at one level in such banalities as, "Be good, sweet maid, and let who will be clever," and at another in such profundities as Kant's distinction between the good will, the possession of which alone is both necessary and sufficient for moral worth, and what he took to be a quite distinct natural gift, that of knowing how to apply general rules to particular cases, a gift the lack of which is called stupidity. So for Kant, one can be both good and stupid, but for Aristotle, stupidity of a certain kind precludes goodness. Moreover, genuine practical intelligence in turn requires knowledge of the good. Indeed, itself requires goodness of a kind in its possessor. Quote, "It is clear that a man cannot have practical intelligence unless he is good." 1144a, line 37. I noticed earlier that modern social practice and theory follows Kant rather than Aristotle at this point, not surprisingly. Hence those characters so essential to the dramatic scripts of modernity. The expert who matches means to ends in an evaluatively neutral way, and the moral agent who is anyone and everyone not actually mentally defective, have no genuine counterpart in Aristotle's scheme, or indeed within the classical tradition at all. It is indeed difficult to envisage the exaltation of bureaucratic expertise in any culture in which the connection between practical intelligence and the moral virtues is firmly established. This connection between practical intelligence and the virtues of character is invoked by Aristotle in the course of his argument that one cannot possess any of the virtues of character in a developed form without possessing all the others. It is difficult to suppose that he seriously means all. It seems obvious that someone can be genuinely brave without being socially agreeable. Yet agreeableness is counted by Aristotle among the virtues, as, of course, is courage. But that is what he says, Nicomachean Ethics 1145a. Nevertheless, it is easy to understand why Aristotle held that the central virtues are intimately related to each other. The just man does not fall into the vice of pleonexia, which is one of the two vices corresponding to the virtue of justice. But in order to avoid pleonexia, it is clear that one must possess sophrosune. The brave man does not fall into the vices of rashness and cowardice, but the rash man seems to be a braggart, and boastfulness is one of the vices relative to the virtue of truthfulness about oneself. This interrelationship of the virtues explains why they do not provide us with a number of distinct criteria by which to judge the goodness of a particular individual, but rather with one complex measure. The application of that measure in a community whose shared aim is the realization of the human good presupposes, of course, a wide range of agreement in that community on goods and virtues, and it is this agreement which makes possible the kind of bond between citizens which, on Aristotle's view, constitutes a polis. That bond is the bond of friendship, and friendship is itself a virtue. The type of friendship which Aristotle has in mind is that which embodies a shared recognition of and pursuit of a good. It is this sharing which is essential and primary to the constitution of any form of community, whether that of a household or that of a city. Lawgivers, says Aristotle, seem to make friendship a more important aim than justice. 1155a, line 24. And the reason is clear. Justice is the virtue of rewarding desert and of repairing failures in rewarding desert within an already constituted community. Friendship is required for that initial constitution. How can we reconcile this view of Aristotle's with his assertion that one cannot have many friends of this kind? Estimates of the population of Athens in the 5th and 4th centuries vary widely, but the number of adult male citizens clearly ran into some tens of thousands. How can a population of such a size be informed by a shared vision of the good? How can friendship be the bond between them? The answer surely is by being composed of a network of small groups of friends, in Aristotle's sense of that word. We are to think, then, of friendship as being the sharing of all in the common project of creating and sustaining the life of the city, a sharing incorporated in the immediacy of an individual's particular friendships. This notion of the political community as a common project is alien to the modern liberal individualist world. This is how we sometimes at least think of schools, hospitals, or philanthropic organizations, but we have no conception of such a form of community concerned, as Aristotle says the polis is concerned, with the whole of life, not with this or that good, but with man's good as such. It is no wonder that friendship has been relegated to private life and thereby weakened in comparison to what it once was. Friendship, of course, on Aristotle's view, involves affection. But that affection arises within a relationship defined in terms of a common allegiance to and a common pursuit of goods. The affection is secondary, which is not in the least to say unimportant. In a modern perspective, affection is often the central issue. Our friends are said to be those whom we like, perhaps whom we like very much. The term friendship has become for the most part the name of a type of emotional state, rather than a type of social and political relationship. E.M. Forster once remarked that if it came to a choice between betraying his country and betraying his friend, he hoped that he would have the courage to betray his country. In an Aristotelian perspective, anyone who can formulate such a contrast has no country, has no polis. He is a citizen of nowhere, an internal exile wherever he lives. Indeed, from an Aristotelian point of view, a modern liberal political society can appear only as a collection of citizens of nowhere, who have banded together for their common protection. They possess, at best, that inferior form of friendship which is founded on mutual advantage. That they lack the bond of friendship is of course bound up with the self-avowed moral pluralism of such liberal societies. They have abandoned the moral unity of Aristotelianism, whether in its ancient or medieval forms. A spokesman for the modern liberal view has of course at first sight an easy rejoinder to Aristotelianism. Aristotle, he might argue with a good deal of cogency, simply offers too simple and too unified a view of the complexities of human good. If we look at the realities of Athenian society, let alone of Greek society as a whole, or the rest of the ancient world, what we in fact find is a recognition of diversity of values, of conflicts between goods, of the virtues not forming a simple, coherent hierarchical unity. Aristotle's portrait is at best an idealization, and his tendency is always, so it might be said, to exaggerate moral coherence and unity. So, for example, on the unity of the virtues, what he has to argue about the detailed variety of interrelationships between virtues and vices does not seem to warrant anything like his own strong conclusion about the unity and inseparability of all the virtues in the character of the good man. With this last particular charge, it is perhaps, as I've already suggested, difficult to disagree. But it is worth asking why Aristotle should, in this particular case, have insisted on what seems to be, even from his own point of view, an unnecessarily strong conclusion. Aristotle's belief in the unity of the virtues is one of the few parts of his moral philosophy which he inherits directly from Plato. As with Plato, the belief is one aspect of a hostility to and denial of conflict either within the life of the individual good man or in that of the good city. Both Plato and Aristotle treat conflict as an evil, and Aristotle treats it as an eliminable evil. The virtues are all in harmony with each other, and the harmony of individual character is reproduced in the harmony of the state. Civil war is the worst of evils for Aristotle as for Plato. The good life for man is itself single and unitary, compounded of a hierarchy of goods. It follows that conflict is simply the result either of flaws of character in individuals or of unintelligent political arrangements. This has consequences not only for Aristotle's politics, but also for his poetics and even his theory of knowledge. In all three, the Agon has been displaced from its Homeric centrality. Just as conflict is not central to a city's life, but is reduced to a threat to that life, so tragedy as understood by Aristotle cannot come near the Homeric insight that tragic conflict is the essential human condition. The tragic hero, on Aristotle's view, fails because of his own flaw, not because the human situation is sometimes irredeemably tragic, and dialectic is no longer the road to truth, but, for the most part, only a semi-formal procedure ancillary to inquiry. Where Socrates argued dialectically with particular individuals, and Plato wrote dialogues, Aristotle therefore produces expository lectures and treatises. There is naturally enough a corresponding striking contrast between the Aristotelian standpoint on theology and either that of Aeschylus or Sophocles. For Aristotle, that particular appeal to the divine, which in both Aeschylus and Sophocles signals the recognition of tragic impasse, can have made no realistic sense. The impersonal, unchanging divinity of which Aristotle speaks, the metaphysical contemplation of which furnishes man with his specific and ultimate telos, can itself take no interest in the merely human, let alone in the dilemmatic. It is nothing other than thought timelessly thinking itself and conscious of nothing but itself. Since such contemplation is the ultimate human telos, the essential, final, and completing ingredient in the life of the man who is eudaimon, there is a certain tension between Aristotle's view of man as essentially political and his view of man as essentially metaphysical. To become eudaimon, material prerequisites and social prerequisites are necessary. The household and the city-state make the metaphysical human project possible, but the goods which they provide are, although necessary and although themselves part of that whole human life, subordinate from the metaphysical standpoint. Nonetheless, in many passages where Aristotle discusses individual virtues, the notion that their possession and practice is in the end subordinate to metaphysical contemplation would seem oddly out of place. For an excellent discussion of the issues, see Krill 1974 and Clark 1979. Consider, for example, once again, Aristotle's discussion of friendship. Aristotle, probably responding to Plato's discussion of friendship in the Lysias, distinguishes three kinds of friendship: that which derives from mutual utility, that which derives from mutual pleasure, and that which derives from a shared concern for goods, which are the goods of both, and therefore exclusively of neither. It is, as I have already had occasion to emphasize, the third, which is genuine friendship, and which provides the paradigm for the relationship between husband and wife in the household, as well as for that between citizen and citizen in the polis. Thus the good man's final achieved self-sufficiency in his contemplation of timeless reason does not entail that the good man does not need friends, just as it does not entail that he does not need a certain level of material prosperity. Correspondingly, a city founded on justice and friendship can only be the best kind of city if it enables its citizens to enjoy the life of metaphysical contemplation. Within this metaphysical and social structure, what is the place of liberty? It is crucial to the structure of Aristotle's extended argument that the virtues are unavailable to slaves or to barbarians, and so therefore is the good for man. What is a barbarian? Not merely a non-Greek, whose language sounds to Hellenic ears like a bar, but someone who lacks a polis, and thereby shows, on Aristotle's view, that he is incapable of political relationships. What are political relationships? The relationships of free men to each other, that is, the relationship between those members of a community who both rule and are ruled over. The free self is simultaneously political subject and political sovereign. Thus to be involved in political relationships entails freedom from any position that is mere subjugation. Freedom is the presupposition of the exercise of the virtues and the achievement of the good. With this part of Aristotle's conclusion we need not quarrel. What is likely to affront us, and rightly, is Aristotle's writing off of non-Greeks, barbarians, and slaves as not merely not possessing political relationships, but as incapable of them. With this we may couple his view that only the affluent and those of high status can achieve certain key virtues. Those of munificence and of magnanimity, craftsmen and tradesmen, constitute an inferior class, even if they are not slaves. Hence, the peculiar excellences of the exercise of craft skill and manual labor are invisible from the standpoint of Aristotle's catalogue of the virtues. This blindness of Aristotle's was not, of course, private to Aristotle. It was part of the general, although not universal, blindness of his culture. It is intimately connected with another form of limitation. Aristotle writes as if barbarians and Greeks both had fixed natures, and in so viewing them, he brings home to us once again the ahistorical character of his understanding of human nature. Individuals as members of a species have a telos, but there is no history of the polis or of Greece or of mankind moving towards a telos. History, indeed, is not a reputable form of inquiry, less philosophical than poetry because it aspires genuinely to deal with individuals, whereas even poetry, on Aristotle's view, deals with types. Aristotle was well aware that the kind of knowledge which he takes to be genuinely scientific, to constitute episteme, knowledge of essential natures grasped through universal necessary truths logically derivable from certain first principles, cannot characteristically be had of human affairs at all. He knew that the appropriate generalizations are ones which hold only epitopolo for the most part, and what he says about them agrees with what I asserted earlier about the generalizations of the modern social scientist. But in spite of this recognition, he apparently felt no need to pursue the question of their character further. This is presumably the source of the paradox that Aristotle, who saw the forms of social life of the city-state as normative for essential human nature, was himself a servant of that Macedonian royal power which destroyed the city-state as a free society. Aristotle did not understand the transience of the polis because he had little or no understanding of historicity in general. Thus a whole range of questions cannot arise for him, including those which concern the ways in which men might pass from being slaves or barbarians to being citizens of a polis. Some men just are slaves by nature, on Aristotle's view. Yet it remains true that these limitations in Aristotle's account of the virtues do not necessarily injure his general scheme for understanding the place of the virtues in human life, let alone deform his multitude of more particular insights. Two of these deserve particular emphasis in any account of the virtues. The first concerns the place of enjoyment in human life. Aristotle's characterization of enjoyment as supervening upon successful activity enables us to understand both why it is plausible to treat enjoyment, or pleasure, or happiness as the telos of human life, and why, nonetheless, this would be a mistake. The enjoyment which Aristotle identifies is that which characteristically accompanies the achievement of excellence in activity. Such activity may be of very different kinds, that is, the writing or translation of poetry, the playing of games, the carrying through of some complex social project, and what counts as excellence will always be relative to the standards of performance for people like us so far. Hence, generally to seek to excel is to aim at doing that which will be enjoyable, and it is natural to conclude that we seek to do that which will give us our pleasure, and so that enjoyment or pleasure or happiness is the telos of our activity. But it is important to note that the very same Aristotelian considerations which lead us towards this conclusion debar us from accepting any view which treats enjoyment or pleasure or happiness as a criterion for guiding our actions. Just because enjoyment of a highly specific kind, I emphasized both the specific and the heterogeneous character of enjoyment earlier when I was discussing Benthamine utilitarianism, supervenes upon each different type of successfully achieved activity, the enjoyment of itself provides us with no good reason for embarking upon one type of activity rather than another. Moreover, what I particularly enjoy will of course depend upon what sort of person I am. And what sort of person I am is of course a matter of my virtues and vices. After the expulsion of Aristotelianism from our culture, there was a period in the 18th century when it was commonplace to suggest, on tombstones, as well as in philosophical works, that the virtues are nothing but those qualities which we happen to find generally pleasant or useful. The oddity of this suggestion lies in the fact that what we find generally pleasant or useful will depend on what virtues are generally possessed and cultivated in our community. Hence, the virtues cannot be defined or identified in terms of the pleasant or useful. To this it may be replied that surely there are qualities which are useful or pleasant to human beings qua members of a particular biological species with a particular kind of environment. The standard of utility or pleasure is set by man qua animal, man prior to and without any particular culture. But man without culture is a myth. Our biological nature certainly places constraints on all cultural possibility. But man who has nothing but biological nature is a creature of whom we know nothing. It is only man with practical intelligence, and that, as we have seen, is intelligence formed by virtues, whom we actively meet in history. And it is on the nature of practical reasoning that Aristotle provides another discussion which is crucially relevant to the character of the virtues. Aristotle's account of practical reasoning is in essentials surely right. It has a number of key features. The first is that Aristotle takes the conclusion to a practical syllogism to be a particular kind of action. The notion that an argument can terminate in an action, of course, offends Humean and post-Humean philosophical prejudices, according to which only statements, or, in some particularly barbarous versions, sentences, can have truth values and enter into those relationships of consistency and inconsistency which partially define deductive argument. But statements themselves only possess these characteristics in virtue of their capacity to express beliefs, and actions can, of course, express beliefs as certainly, although not always as clearly or unambiguously, as utterances can. It is because, and only because of this, that we can be puzzled by the inconsistency between a given agent's actions and his statements. We should be puzzled, for example, by someone of whom we knew three things, that is, first, that he wanted to keep healthy. Secondly, that he had sincerely asserted both that he wanted, Secondly, that he had sincerely asserted both that to get cold and wet could be bad for his health, and that the only way to keep warm and dry in winter was to wear his overcoat, and thirdly, that he habitually in winter went out without his overcoat. For his action appears to express a belief inconsistent with his other expressed beliefs. Where anyone systematically were anyone systematically inconsistent in this way, he or she would soon become unintelligible to those around him. We should not know how to respond to them, for we could no longer hope to identify either what they were doing or what they meant by what they said, or both. Thus, Aristotle's account of the practical syllogism can be construed as providing a statement of necessary conditions for intelligible human action, and as doing so in a way that must hold for any recognizably human culture. Practical reasoning then has, on Aristotle's view, four essential elements. There are, first of all, the wants and goals of the agent, presupposed but not expressed in his reasoning. Without these, there would be no context for the reasoning, and the major and minor premises could not adequately determine what kind of thing the agent is to do. The second element is the major premise, an assertion to the effect that doing or having or seeking such and such is the type of thing that is good for or needed by so-and-so, where the agent uttering the syllogism falls under the latter description. The third element is the minor premise wherein the agent, relying on a perceptual judgment, asserts that this is an instance or occasion of the requisite kind. The conclusion, as I already said, is the action. This account returns us to the question of the relationship between practical intelligence and the virtues. For the judgments which provide the agent's practical reasoning with premises will include judgments as to what it is good for someone like him to do and to be, and an agent's capacity to make and to act upon such judgments will depend upon what intellectual and moral virtues and vices compose his or her character. The precise nature of this connection could only be elucidated by a fuller account of practical reasoning than Aristotle gives us. His account is notably elliptical and in need of paraphrase and interpretation. But he says quite enough to show us how, from an Aristotelian standpoint, reason cannot be the servant of the passions. For the education of the passions into conformity with, pursuit of what theoretical reasoning identifies as the telos and practical reasoning as the right action to do in each particular time and place, is what ethics is about. We have, in the course of this account, identified a number of points at which Aristotle's account of the virtues can be seriously put in question. Some of these concern parts of Aristotle's theory which not only have to be rejected, but whose rejection need not carry any large implication for our attitudes to his overall theory. So it is, I have suggested, with Aristotle's indefensible defense of slavery. But in at least three areas, questions arise which, unless they can be answered satisfactorily, endanger the whole Aristotelian structure. The first of these concerns the way in which Aristotle's teleology presupposes his metaphysical biology. If we reject that biology, as we must, is there any way in which that teleology can be preserved? Some modern moral philosophers who are deeply sympathetic to Aristotle's account of the virtues have seen no problem here. It has been argued that all we need to provide in order to justify an account of the virtues and vices is some very general account of what human flourishing and well-being consists in. The virtues can then be adequately characterized as those qualities necessary to promote such flourishing and well-being, because whatever our disagreements in detail on that subject, we ought to be able to rationally agree on what is a virtue and what is a vice. This view ignores the place in our cultural history of deep conflicts over what human flourishing and well-being do consist in, and the way in which rival and incompatible beliefs on that topic beget rival and incompatible tables of the virtues. Aristotle and Nietzsche, Hume and the New Testament are names which represent polar oppositions on these matters. Hence, any adequate teleological account must provide us with some clear and defensible account of the telos, and any adequate generally Aristotelian account must supply a teleological account which could replace Aristotle's metaphysical biology. A second area of questioning concerns the relationship of ethics to the structure of the polis. If a good deal of the detail of Aristotle's account of the virtues presupposes the now long-vanished context of the social relationships of the ancient city-state, how can Aristotelianism be formulated so as to be a moral presence in a world in which there are no city-states? Or, to put matters in another way, is it possible to be an Aristotelian and yet to view the city-state in an historical perspective as only one, even if a very important one, in a series of social and political forms, in and through which the kind of self which can exemplify the virtues can be found and educated, and in which that self can find its arena? Thirdly, there are the questions posed by Aristotle's inheritance of Plato's belief in the unity and harmony of both the individual soul and the city-state, and Aristotle's consequent perception of conflict as something to be avoided or managed. The problem which I am raising is best stated initially in terms of a confrontation between Aristotle and Sophocles. For Aristotle, as I have already suggested, the tragic form of narrative is enacted when and only when we have a hero with a flaw in practical intelligence which springs from inadequate possession or exercise of some virtue. In a world in which everyone is good enough, therefore, there would be no tragic hero to be portrayed. Aristotle clearly derives this view partly from his moral psychology, but partly from his own reading of tragic drama, and especially of Oedipus Rex. Yet if my earlier account of Sophocles is correct, Aristotle's moral psychology has led him to misread Sophocles. For the conflicts of tragedy certainly may in part take the form that they do because of the flaws in Antigone and Creon, Odysseus and Philocrates. But what constitutes those true individuals' tragic opposition and conflict is the conflict of good with good, embodied in their encounter prior to and independent of any individual characteristics. And to this aspect of tragedy, Aristotle in the Poetics is and has to be blind. The absence of this view of the centrality of opposition and conflict in human life conceals from Aristotle also one important source of human learning about and one important milieu of human practice of the virtues. The great Australian philosopher John Anderson urged us not to ask of a social institution what end or purpose does it serve, but rather of what conflicts is it the scene. Passmore, 1962, page 22. If Aristotle had asked this question both of the polis and of the individual agent, he would have had an additional resource for understanding the teleological character of both the virtues and the social forms which provide them with a context. For it was Anderson's insight, a Sophoclean insight, that it is through conflict, and sometimes only through conflict, that we learn what our ends and purposes are.